An expanded treatment of the pre-Viking Scandinavian world requires moving slowly and carefully through every layer of life that existed before overseas expansion became common. This world was not simple or static. It was the product of long-term adaptation to environment, inherited customs, and gradual social change. The Viking Age grew out of this setting, and its character cannot be understood without a deep and patient examination of these foundations. Scandinavia before the Viking Age was defined first by its geography. The region consisted of long coastlines broken by fjords, islands, and sheltered inlets, alongside vast inland forests, mountains, lakes, and marshlands. Arable land was unevenly distributed. Some coastal and lowland areas supported farming, while others were suited mainly to grazing, fishing, or hunting. This uneven landscape encouraged regional variation rather than uniform development. Communities adapted locally, developing ways of life closely tied to their immediate surroundings. Climate shaped every aspect of daily existence. Winters were long and often severe. Summers were short but intense, requiring efficient use of time for planting, harvesting, and preparation. Seasonal rhythms governed work patterns, food availability, and social interaction. The year was experienced not as a continuous flow, but as a cycle of tasks that repeated with variation and uncertainty. Settlement patterns reflected these realities. Most people lived in dispersed rural communities rather than dense population centers. Farms were often isolated or grouped loosely with nearby households. Each farmstead was a center of production, storage, and social life. Buildings were constructed from locally available materials, primarily wood, turf, and stone. Houses were designed to retain heat and shelter people and animals through winter months. The household was the core of society. It functioned as an economic unit, a social unit, and a legal entity. Extended families often lived together, including multiple generations. Authority within the household rested with senior members, but cooperation was essential. Survival depended on collective effort rather than individual success. Work within the household was continuous and varied. Agricultural labor dominated during warmer months. Fields were prepared, sown, tended, and harvested using hand tools and animal power. Grain was processed manually, requiring time-consuming labor. During winter, attention shifted to maintenance, craft production, and care of livestock. Livestock management was central to household economy. Animals were valuable assets and required careful oversight. Herds were moved seasonally between grazing areas. Hay was cut and stored to sustain animals through winter. Decisions about breeding, slaughter, and trade were made with long-term survival in mind. Animal products were used extensively, minimizing waste. Fishing supplemented agriculture and livestock, particularly in coastal and riverine regions. Knowledge of seasonal fish movements and preservation techniques was essential. Fish could be dried or smoked for long-term storage, providing reliable nutrition during lean months. Marine resources expanded dietary options and reduced dependence on crops alone. Hunting and gathering remained important, especially in forested and inland areas. Wild game, berries, nuts, and plants contributed to diet and material culture. Furs and hides were valuable trade goods. These activities required deep environmental knowledge and reinforced connection to landscape. Craft production was integrated into daily life. Tools, clothing, containers, and household items were produced locally. Spinning, weaving, leatherworking, and woodworking were common skills. Metalworking required specialized knowledge and access to raw materials, but small-scale iron production was widespread. These crafts supported self-sufficiency while allowing for exchange between communities. Trade existed alongside subsistence production. Exchange networks linked communities within Scandinavia and beyond. Goods moved along waterways and coastal routes. Amber, furs, iron, and crafted objects were traded for items not locally available. Trade reinforced social ties and exposed communities to external influences without disrupting local life. Social hierarchy was present but relatively flexible. Free individuals formed the majority of the population. They owned or controlled land and participated in community decision-making. Social status was influenced by wealth, reputation, kinship, and ability rather than rigid class structures. Below free individuals were those with limited autonomy whose status varied widely and could change over time. Political organization was decentralized. Authority rested with local leaders who exercised influence through persuasion, reputation, and material resources. Leadership was not absolute. It depended on maintaining support through fair judgment, protection, and generosity. Assemblies provided forums for resolving disputes and affirming collective norms. Law was customary and communal. It emphasized balance and compensation rather than centralized enforcement. Disputes were addressed publicly, reinforcing shared responsibility. Memory, precedent, and oral transmission sustained legal culture across generations. Belief systems were deeply embedded in everyday life. Religious practice was local and practical rather than institutional. Rituals marked seasonal transitions, agricultural cycles, and family events. Sacred spaces were often tied to natural features or communal gathering places. These practices reinforced continuity and social cohesion. Oral tradition preserved collective memory. Stories, genealogies, and myths transmitted values and knowledge. They explained the world, reinforced identity, and connected present communities to ancestral pasts. Oral culture shaped perception of time, emphasizing continuity rather than rupture. Mobility was a normal aspect of life. Travel occurred for trade, marriage, assemblies, and seasonal work. Boats and waterways facilitated movement. Maritime skills were widespread long before overseas expansion. Shipbuilding knowledge developed gradually through experimentation and adaptation. Population dynamics influenced social change. Gradual population growth increased pressure on land. Inheritance practices divided holdings, reducing individual plots over time. This created tension and encouraged exploration of alternatives. These pressures accumulated slowly and unevenly across regions. Technological development supported mobility and adaptation. Ship design improved incrementally, producing vessels capable of navigating both open seas and inland waters. These ships were practical tools, rather than symbols of conquest at this stage. Daily life was shaped by cooperation, routine, and resilience. Survival depended on planning, foresight, and mutual support. Community bonds were reinforced through shared labor, ritual, and responsibility. Despite hardship, these societies were stable and sustainable within their environment. Conflict existed but was constrained. Violence was regulated by social norms and legal mechanisms. Feuds and disputes were managed to prevent lasting disruption. Stability was valued as prolonged conflict threatened survival. By the late 8th century, Scandinavian societies were mature, complex, and outwardly connected. They possessed the skills, resources, and social frameworks necessary for expanded movement. The Viking Age emerged not from chaos or desperation, but from this well-established world. The foundations of the Viking Age lay in everyday life, accumulated knowledge, and gradual adaptation. When overseas exploration increased, it carried forward familiar patterns of work, authority, belief, and social organization. The Viking Age was not a break from the past, but an extension of it into new spaces. The early Viking Age emerged gradually during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, shaped by long-standing patterns of movement, exchange, and local conflict that already existed within Scandinavia. Overseas activity did not begin as a coordinated or unified effort. Instead, it developed through many small decisions made by individuals and groups, responding to opportunity, necessity, and inherited practice. Exploration and raiding were not separate from daily life, but extensions of it, carried out by people whose social worlds remained rooted in their home communities. The earliest overseas journeys were closely tied to seafaring traditions that had developed over generations. Scandinavian communities were accustomed to traveling by water for trade, communication, and seasonal movement. Rivers, coastal routes, and open seas were familiar environments rather than barriers. Boats were tools of daily life, used for fishing, transport, and exchange. The transition from regional travel to longer-distance voyages did not require a fundamental change in mindset, only an expansion of scale. Improved ship design supported this expansion. Long, narrow vessels with shallow drafts allowed travel across open water while still navigating rivers and coastal shallows. These ships were not built for a single purpose. They could carry people, animals, tools, and goods. They were powered primarily by oars, with sails used when conditions allowed. Their flexibility made them suitable for exploration, trade, and conflict alike. Early voyages were often seasonal. Crews left during favorable weather and returned before winter. These journeys were limited in duration and scope. Crews were small, usually drawn from local communities or extended kin networks. Participation was shaped by age, status, and opportunity. Younger men often formed the core of these crews, though older individuals with experience played important roles in leadership and navigation. Raiding emerged alongside exploration but did not immediately dominate it. Early raids were typically short and targeted. Coastal sites were chosen for accessibility rather than symbolic value. These encounters were not always violent. Some involved negotiation, exchange, or opportunistic theft rather than organized attack. The distinction between trade and raiding was often unclear, shaped by circumstance rather than intention. The motivations behind early raiding were varied. Material gain was one factor, but not the only one. Prestige, reputation, and the reinforcement of social status played significant roles. Success abroad could enhance standing at home, strengthening claims to leadership, marriage prospects, and inheritance. These social incentives were deeply rooted in Scandinavian values that emphasized achievement and recognition. News of successful voyages spread through oral networks. Stories of distant lands, valuable goods, and vulnerable settlements circulated at assemblies and gatherings. These accounts encouraged imitation rather than coordination. Each voyage built upon the knowledge gained by earlier ones, gradually expanding geographic awareness. Early contact with foreign communities introduced new goods into Scandinavian life. Silver, textiles, glass, and other items entered local economies through exchange or seizure. These objects were not merely wealth, they carried social meaning, displayed at gatherings or redistributed to reinforce relationships. The circulation of foreign goods strengthened existing systems of gift-giving and alliance-building. Exploration also exposed Scandinavian travelers to different social and religious environments. Monastic settlements, trading towns, and agricultural communities operated under unfamiliar rules. These encounters did not immediately transform Scandinavian beliefs, but they added to collective knowledge. Understanding how foreign societies functioned became a practical skill, shaping future interactions. The early Viking Age was not marked by centralized planning or shared ideology. There was no single purpose driving overseas activity. Instead, it reflected the cumulative effect of many individual actions. Some voyages failed, ending in loss or hardship. Others succeeded and were remembered. Over time, patterns emerged from repetition rather than design. At home, daily life continued much as before. Farming, craft production, and local governance remained the foundation of society. Overseas activities supplemented these routines rather than replacing them. Those who traveled returned to familiar roles, bringing with them goods, stories, and experience. Their absence and return were integrated into seasonal rhythms. Raiding did not involve the majority of the population. Most people never traveled overseas. The image of a society wholly oriented toward warfare does not reflect early reality. Instead, a relatively small proportion of individuals engaged in these activities, while the broader community provided social and economic support. The response of foreign communities to early Viking activity varied. Some adapted quickly, reinforcing defenses or negotiating terms. Others were caught unprepared. Over time, awareness spread, altering patterns of interaction. These responses shaped the nature of later encounters, influencing where and how Scandinavian groups traveled. By the early 9th century, overseas activity had become a recognized option within Scandinavian society. It was no longer exceptional, but it was not universal. The early Viking Age remained a period of experimentation. Routes were tested, relationships formed, and practices refined through experience rather than planning. This phase laid the groundwork for more sustained expansion. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Ships improved incrementally. Social incentives aligned with opportunity. The combination of these factors transformed occasional voyages into regular movement. The Viking Age did not accelerate suddenly, but it did become more established through repetition. The early period of exploration and raiding, therefore, represents a transitional stage. It connects the inward-focused world of pre-Viking Scandinavia with the outward-reaching networks that followed. Daily life remained rooted in local communities, even as horizons expanded. The balance between home and abroad defined this phase, shaping the character of later developments. The expansion of Scandinavian activity across the North Sea marked a gradual but decisive change in the rhythm of Viking life. During the 9th and early 10th centuries, movement across these waters became more regular, more familiar, and more deeply integrated into everyday existence. What had once been occasional journeys now formed part of a wider pattern of connection linking Scandinavia with surrounding lands. This expansion did not replace older ways of living but extended them, carrying daily routines, social structures, and practical knowledge into new environments. The North Sea itself shaped this phase of expansion. It was not an empty space, but a shared maritime zone, bordered by many coastlines, islands, estuaries, and river mouths. For Scandinavian seafarers, these waters were demanding but navigable. Travel depended on experience rather than instruments. Sailors learned to read winds, waves, clouds, and currents. They memorized coastlines and landmarks. Knowledge accumulated slowly and was passed on through shared practice rather than formal instruction. Voyages across the North Sea were typically seasonal. Crews departed when weather conditions allowed and daylight was long enough to support navigation. Most journeys were planned with the expectation of return, even when stays abroad extended for months or years. Ships carried not only people but tools, weapons, livestock, and supplies, reflecting the expectation of continued daily life rather than brief interruption. As contact increased, certain routes became familiar. Islands served as stopping points, providing shelter and resources. River mouths allowed access deep into inland regions. Over time, these routes formed informal corridors of movement, linking Scandinavian homelands with the British Isles and surrounding coasts. Travel along these corridors became routine enough that absence and return were incorporated into household planning and seasonal labor cycles. Early encounters along North Sea coasts varied widely. Some involved direct conflict, others trade, and many fell somewhere between. Scandinavian groups assessed each situation according to opportunity and risk. Local defenses, population density, and access to resources influenced decisions. There was no uniform approach. Flexibility and adaptation remained central. As activity increased, temporary camps and bases appeared along coastlines. These sites were practical rather than monumental. They offered places to repair ships, store goods, and rest crews. Over time, Some of these temporary sites developed into more permanent settlements. This process was gradual and unplanned, shaped by repeated use rather than formal decision. Settlement abroad introduced new patterns into Viking daily life. People who stayed for extended periods needed to secure food, shelter, and social order. Houses were constructed using local materials, often blending Scandinavian building traditions with regional techniques. Structures were designed for practicality, emphasizing warmth, storage, and shared space. Food production became central to settlement life. Where land permitted, fields were cleared and cultivated. Familiar crops were planted when possible, though adaptation to local soil and climate was often necessary. Livestock was raised or acquired locally. Fishing remained essential, especially in coastal regions, providing a reliable food source and reducing dependence on agriculture alone. Daily routines in these settlements closely resembled those of Scandinavia. Work followed seasonal rhythms. Spring and summer focused on cultivation, fishing, and construction. Autumn involved harvest and preparation for winter. Winter months emphasized maintenance, craft production, and communal activities. These routines provided continuity amid unfamiliar surroundings. Craft production remained household-based. Textiles were spun and woven, tools were repaired or made as needed. Metalworking continued on a small scale, supporting agricultural and domestic needs. Imported goods entered these settlements through trade or movement, but they supplemented rather than replaced local production. Social organization within overseas communities relied heavily on existing Scandinavian norms. Kinship networks remained important, even when families were separated by distance. Leadership was informal and situational, based on experience, reputation, and the ability to manage disputes. Assemblies continued to function as spaces for collective decision-making and conflict resolution. Interaction with local populations varied by region and circumstance. In some areas, Scandinavian settlers lived alongside existing communities, sharing resources and exchanging goods. Intermarriage occurred gradually, often driven by practical considerations rather than policy. Language and custom adapted through daily contact, producing blended practices over time. In other regions, relationships were more distant. Separation could be maintained through geography, custom, or mutual caution. Even in such cases, economic interaction often continued. Trade required communication and negotiation, fostering limited but sustained contact. Children born or raised in overseas settlements grew up in these mixed environments. They learned skills and customs through practice rather than instruction. Identity was shaped slowly, reflecting both Scandinavian heritage and local influence. This process was gradual and unremarked, embedded in daily routines rather than deliberate change. Maritime activity remained constant. Boats connected settlements to each other and to Scandinavia. These journeys carried news, goods, and people. The movement of silver, tools, textiles, and livestock reinforced economic ties. Stories and information circulated alongside material goods, shaping collective understanding of the wider world. Religion and belief continued to structure daily life, though practices adapted to new settings. Rituals marked seasonal change, birth, death, and significant events. Sacred spaces were established or adapted within settlements. Belief provided continuity and reassurance, grounding communities in familiar frameworks amid unfamiliar landscapes. Not all Scandinavian activity involved permanent settlement. Many individuals continued seasonal patterns, moving between home and abroad. Others shifted roles over time, alternating between farming, trading, and warfare. This flexibility allowed communities to respond to changing conditions without abandoning established ways of life. Over time, certain regions experienced sustained Scandinavian presence, leading to more structured patterns of settlement and governance. In parts of England, areas later known as the Danelaw reflected this process. These regions were not isolated enclaves, but integrated spaces shaped by interaction, adaptation, and shared daily life. The expansion across the North Sea did not erase differences between communities, but it connected them through repeated contact. Familiar routines traveled with people, anchoring them in continuity even as surroundings changed. Viking life abroad was not defined solely by movement or conflict, but by work, family, and obligation carried into new contexts. This phase of expansion, therefore, represents a deepening of engagement rather than simple outward movement. Scandinavian societies extended themselves across water, weaving new spaces into existing patterns of life. Daily existence remained grounded in routine and cooperation, even as horizons widened and connections multiplied. From these settled and semi-settled communities, further expansion and integration would follow. The North Sea became not a boundary, but a shared space of movement, linking regions through ordinary acts repeated over time. The next phase of the Viking Age was shaped by sustained settlement, expanding trade, and ongoing cultural exchange across the British Isles and the North Atlantic. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Scandinavian activity in these regions moved beyond repeated contact and short-term occupation. It became a more permanent presence, marked by communities that balanced continuity with adaptation. Daily life in these settlements developed slowly, shaped by familiar practices carried from Scandinavia and by the demands of new environments. The British Isles offered a range of landscapes and social settings. Coastal plains, river valleys, uplands, and islands each presented different opportunities and constraints. Scandinavian settlers adapted selectively, choosing locations that allowed access to arable land, pasture, fishing grounds, and maritime routes. Settlement was rarely uniform. It occurred in clusters shaped by geography, existing infrastructure, and patterns of movement. Early Scandinavian settlements in the British Isles often grew from sites that had already seen repeated contact. Seasonal camps evolved into year-round communities. In some cases, abandoned or lightly populated areas were occupied. In others, settlers lived alongside existing populations. These arrangements were shaped by negotiation, conflict, and practical necessity rather than formal policy. Housing reflected both continuity and adaptation. Buildings were constructed using local materials, including timber, stone, and turf. Layouts often followed familiar Scandinavian forms, with longhouses serving as centers of domestic and social life. Interiors were organized around shared spaces for work, eating, and rest. Fire provided warmth, light, and a focal point for daily activity. Agriculture formed the foundation of settled life. Fields were cleared and cultivated using familiar techniques, adjusted to local soil and climate. Grain production remained important, though reliance on mixed farming reduced risk. Livestock grazing was adapted to available pasture. Seasonal movement of animals continued where geography allowed. Fishing remained central, particularly in coastal and island communities. Rivers and estuaries provided additional resources. Preservation techniques ensured food security through winter months. These practices were embedded in daily routines and required cooperation among households. Craft production continued largely within households. Textile work, tool repair, and woodworking supported everyday needs. Specialized skills existed, but were closely tied to local demand. Imported goods entered these communities through trade, adding variety and status value without displacing local production. Trade networks expanded steadily. Scandinavian settlers participated in regional and long-distance exchange. Goods moved between settlements, towns, and across seas. Silver circulated widely, supporting gift-giving and social relationships. Trade reinforced connections across distance, linking the British Isles to Scandinavia and beyond. Urban centers also played a role. Towns that had existed before Scandinavian settlement became points of interaction. Some towns expanded or adapted in response to increased movement. Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen became part of urban life, contributing to economic activity while maintaining distinct cultural practices. Social organization within settlements remained based on kinship and personal relationships. Leadership depended on experience, reputation, and the ability to manage resources. Assemblies continued to function as spaces for collective decision-making and dispute resolution. These practices reinforced stability and continuity. Law and custom adapted to mixed communities. Scandinavian legal traditions interacted with existing systems, producing local variation. Disputes were resolved through negotiation and compensation where possible. Public assemblies reinforced shared norms, even as populations diversified. Cultural exchange occurred through daily interaction, rather than deliberate integration. Language, dress, and custom evolved gradually. Intermarriage created familial connections that bridged cultural boundaries. Children grew up learning multiple traditions through practice rather than instruction. Religious life remained rooted in familiar belief systems, though exposure to new traditions introduced variation. Rituals marked seasonal change and life events. Sacred spaces were adapted to new landscapes. Belief provided continuity amid change, grounding communities in shared frameworks. Beyond the British Isles, settlement extended into the North Atlantic. Islands such as the Faroes and later Iceland offered opportunities for new communities. These settlements were shaped by isolation, limited resources, and strong reliance on cooperation. Daily life emphasized self-sufficiency, careful resource management, and social cohesion. In these remote settings, familiar practices were adapted to new constraints. Farming focused on livestock and hardy crops. Fishing and hunting supplemented food supply. Social organization relied heavily on assemblies and shared norms, reinforcing order without centralized authority. Settlement in the North Atlantic demonstrated the adaptability of Viking life. Communities carried familiar routines into challenging environments, adjusting gradually through experience. These settlements were not extensions of centralized power, but expressions of communal resilience. Across the British Isles and the North Atlantic, Viking settlement reshaped daily life without abandoning continuity. Work, family, belief, and obligation remained central. Expansion did not erase local variation, but added new layers of connection and exchange. This phase of the Viking Age was defined less by conquest than by persistence. Communities endured through routine, cooperation, and adaptation. Through settlement and trade, Viking societies became part of a wider world, linked by ordinary acts repeated over generations. From these established communities, further movement and interaction would continue. Expansion along rivers and deeper into continental Europe would shape the next stage of Viking life, extending familiar patterns into new directions. The expansion of Viking activity into Western continental Europe unfolded gradually through river systems, coastal zones, and established trade corridors. This phase did not represent a new departure from earlier patterns, but a continuation of familiar practices applied to different geographic and social contexts. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Scandinavian groups became regular participants in the life of regions stretching along the Atlantic coast and deep inland through river valleys. Daily life adapted to these environments while retaining core structures shaped in Scandinavia. Western Europe offered extensive river networks that functioned as natural routes of movement. Rivers such as the Seine, Loire, and Rhine allowed travel far beyond the coast. Viking ships designed for shallow waters could navigate these rivers with relative ease. This mobility enabled repeated contact rather than isolated encounters. Early movement along rivers often followed patterns already established by trade. Scandinavian travelers were not entering unknown spaces. These regions were connected by long-standing economic networks linking towns, monasteries, estates, and markets. Viking activity intersected with these networks, sometimes disrupting them, sometimes integrating into them. The distinction between raiding and trading remained fluid, shaped by circumstance and opportunity. Coastal regions were often the first points of contact. Harbors, river mouths, and estuaries provided access and resources. Temporary camps appeared near these sites, serving as places to rest, repair ships, and organize movement inland. Over time, some of these camps became more permanent, reflecting repeated use rather than deliberate settlement planning. Daily life within these Western European contexts required adjustment. Climate, agricultural practices, and social organization differed from those of Scandinavia. Viking groups adapted selectively. Where land was fertile, farming was introduced or integrated into existing systems. Where agriculture was less accessible, fishing, hunting, and trade remained central. Interaction with local populations varied widely. In some regions, Viking groups encountered established political authority capable of resistance or negotiation. In others, fragmented local power structures allowed greater freedom of movement. Relationships were shaped by local conditions rather than overarching strategy. Work routines reflected a balance between movement and residence. Some individuals remained mobile, traveling seasonally along rivers and coasts. Others stayed longer in specific areas, developing relationships and routines tied to local resources. These patterns often overlapped within the same group, allowing flexibility. Craft production continued to support daily needs. Tools, weapons, and household items were maintained or produced locally. Metalworking and woodworking skills were applied wherever materials were available. Imported goods circulated through exchange, reinforcing social ties and economic networks. Trade played an increasingly important role. Western Europe offered access to goods such as wine, grain, textiles, and silver. These items entered Scandinavian networks, altering patterns of consumption and display. Trade required negotiation and familiarity with local customs, encouraging sustained contact. Urban centers became focal points of interaction. Towns along rivers and coasts served as markets and administrative hubs. Viking presence in these areas was often intermittent but recurring. Merchants, craftsmen, and intermediaries facilitated exchange, blending daily routines with broader networks. Religion and belief remained part of daily life, though exposure to Christian institutions was more direct in Western Europe. Monasteries and churches were prominent features of the landscape. Viking groups interacted with these institutions in varied ways, shaped by immediate needs rather than ideological opposition. Over time, repeated interaction led to accommodation. Some Viking leaders entered agreements with local rulers, securing land or privileges in exchange for service or stability. These arrangements reflected practical considerations rather than long-term planning. They allowed Viking groups to integrate into existing structures while retaining distinct identities. Family life adapted accordingly. Some individuals formed long-term relationships with local populations. Children born into these environments grew up navigating blended cultural practices. Language, custom, and daily routines evolved through practice rather than formal integration. Violence remained part of this phase, but was not constant. Conflict occurred when interests clashed, but stability was often more beneficial. The need to secure food, shelter, and cooperation encouraged negotiation. Over time, predictable patterns of interaction replaced uncertainty. The river-based expansion into Western Europe illustrates how Viking life extended into new regions without abandoning its foundations. Movement remained purposeful but grounded in everyday needs. Work, family, and obligation shaped decisions as much as opportunity or ambition. This phase reinforced the adaptability of Viking societies. Familiar practices were applied flexibly, allowing communities to function across diverse environments. Western Europe became part of a wider network of movement and exchange, linked by ordinary actions repeated over time. From these river corridors and coastal zones, Viking activity would continue to expand eastward and southward, integrating even broader networks of trade and daily life. The next phase would deepen engagement along the Baltic and river systems leading toward Eastern Europe. The expansion of Viking activity eastward along the Baltic Sea and into the great river systems of Eastern Europe unfolded slowly and steadily over the 9th and 10th centuries. This movement differed in important ways from Western expansion, not because Viking life changed in its foundations, but because the landscapes, societies, and economic opportunities of the East shaped daily routines differently. Here, long-distance trade, sustained travel, and repeated interaction with diverse communities became defining features of everyday experience. The Baltic Sea formed the central corridor of this Eastern world. Its relatively enclosed waters connected Scandinavia to the coasts of present-day Finland, the Eastern Baltic, and the river mouths leading deep into the continent. Seasonal travel across the Baltic was demanding but predictable. Mariners relied on established coastal routes, island chains, and familiar landmarks. Over time, these journeys became routine, embedded in cycles of departure and return that households planned for well in advance. From the Baltic coast, river systems offered access far beyond what overland travel allowed. Rivers such as the Dnieper River and the Volga River formed long corridors linking northern forests to southern plains and distant seas. Viking ships, light and shallow drafted, could be hauled between waterways where necessary, allowing continuous movement across vast distances. This practice required coordination, labor, and local knowledge, turning travel itself into a structured daily activity. Eastern movement was closely tied to trade. Unlike some Western encounters that emphasized raiding, Eastern routes were shaped primarily by exchange. Scandinavian travelers carried goods valued in distant markets, including furs, hides, honey, wax, and enslaved people acquired through local networks. These goods were exchanged for silver, textiles, spices, and other items that circulated back through the same routes. Trade required patience and predictability. Journeys were long and could take months or years. Travelers often overwintered in river settlements, returning home only after extended absence. Daily life during these periods focused on maintenance, negotiation, and cooperation with local communities. Camps and trading posts developed along rivers, serving as recurring points of rest, exchange, and social interaction. These settlements were not cities in the formal sense, but functional communities shaped by movement. Houses and storage structures were built for durability and reuse. Food production relied on a combination of local sourcing, fishing, and trade. Routines emphasized preparation and preservation, ensuring survival during long stays away from home. Interaction with local populations was constant. Eastern Europe was home to diverse communities with their own social structures and economic practices. Scandinavian travelers learned to navigate these environments through negotiation rather than force. Agreements were made regarding passage, trade, and settlement. Over time, mutual dependence developed, grounded in shared economic interest. Leadership within traveling groups emphasized experience and reliability. Navigating long routes required detailed knowledge of terrain, seasonal conditions, and social expectations. Leaders coordinated movement, managed disputes, and represented groups in negotiation. Authority remained personal and situational, shaped by trust built through repeated journeys. Religion and belief accompanied travelers, but adapted quietly to new contexts. Rituals were observed privately or in small groups, marking transitions such as departure, arrival, and seasonal change. Sacred practices provided continuity amid extended absence from home, reinforcing identity without demanding uniform expression. The scale of Eastern travel influenced household life back in Scandinavia. Extended absences required careful planning. Farms and households were maintained by remaining members, often with support from kin. The expectation of delayed return shaped inheritance arrangements, labor division, and seasonal planning. Eastern trade was integrated into domestic economy rather than standing apart from it. Silver played a particularly important role in this Eastern world. Large quantities of silver entered Scandinavian circulation through Eastern routes, often in the form of coins or ingots. This silver was not simply wealth, but a medium of social exchange. It was divided, weighed, gifted, and redistributed, reinforcing relationships and obligations within communities. The southern reaches of Eastern trade brought Viking travelers into indirect contact with major political and economic centers, such as the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. These contacts were mediated through multiple layers of exchange rather than direct control. Goods and information moved through networks shaped by many participants, not dominated by any single group. Daily life along Eastern routes emphasized endurance and routine. Travel required constant attention to equipment, animals, and supplies. Boats were repaired regularly. Clothing and tools were maintained carefully. Food was prepared in simple ways, emphasizing preservation and efficiency. These routines repeated across journeys, creating a stable pattern within an otherwise fluid environment. Cultural exchange occurred through ordinary interaction rather than deliberate adoption. Language, dress, and custom influenced one another slowly. Children born in trading settlements grew up with blended practices, learning skills necessary for movement, negotiation, and cooperation. Identity remained flexible, shaped by participation rather than strict origin. Conflict was present but limited by practical necessity. Sustained trade depended on predictability. Violence disrupted routes and endangered investment. As a result, negotiation and accommodation were often preferred. Disputes were resolved through compensation, agreement, or separation rather than prolonged confrontation. By the 10th century, Eastern routes had become established corridors of movement. They connected Scandinavian communities to distant regions through repeated ordinary acts of travel and exchange. These routes were not exceptional adventures, but structured elements of life for those involved. The eastern expansion of Viking activity demonstrates how daily life adapted to extended movement without losing its foundations. Work, obligation, and routine traveled alongside goods and people. The river systems of Eastern Europe became part of a familiar world, integrated through repetition rather than conquest. From these networks of trade and travel, Viking societies gained access to wider economic systems while remaining grounded in household and community life. The experience of sustained Eastern engagement would influence social organization, wealth distribution, and identity, shaping the next phase of Viking society as it matured and stabilized. The maturation of Viking societies during the later 9th, 10th, and early 11th centuries was expressed most clearly in the development of social structure, law, belief, and the routines of domestic life. By this stage, overseas activity, settlement, and trade were no longer novel experiences. They had become established elements of life that shaped how communities organized themselves internally. The focus of daily existence increasingly rested on maintaining order, continuity, and cooperation within societies that were now larger, wealthier, and more interconnected than before. Viking social structure remained grounded in the household, which continued to serve as the primary unit of production, identity, and authority. Households varied widely in size and composition. Some included extended families spanning several generations, while others were smaller and more flexible. Dependents, laborers, and individuals of limited freedom often lived and worked within these households, contributing to their maintenance and stability. The household was not only a place of residence but also a center of work, storage, and decision-making. Status within Viking society was shaped by a combination of birth, wealth, reputation, and personal relationships. Free individuals formed the core of the population. Among them, distinctions emerged between those who controlled substantial land and resources and those whose holdings were more modest. Wealth was visible in livestock, land, tools, clothing, and access to trade goods. Reputation was reinforced through participation in assemblies, fulfillment of obligations, and the ability to manage disputes. Leadership was exercised locally and personally. Chieftains and other prominent figures derived authority from land ownership, family connections, and the support of followers. Their role involved mediation, protection, and generosity rather than centralized command. Leaders were expected to host gatherings, support dependents, and uphold customary law. Failure to meet these expectations could result in loss of support. Law formed a central pillar of Viking social order. Legal traditions were customary and orally transmitted, relying on memory, precedent, and collective participation. Assemblies served as formal spaces for legal and political activity. These gatherings brought together free members of the community to hear disputes, negotiate settlements, and affirm shared norms. Law emphasized balance and compensation, aiming to restore social harmony rather than impose punishment alone. Legal processes were highly structured. Despite the absence of written codes in many areas, procedures for accusation, defense, testimony, and judgment followed established patterns. Witnesses and oaths played important roles. Compensation was carefully assessed according to status, injury, and circumstance. These practices reinforced predictability and trust, allowing communities to function without centralized enforcement. Belief systems continued to shape daily life in subtle but pervasive ways. Religious practice remained decentralized and embedded in routine. Rituals marked seasonal transitions, agricultural cycles, and significant life events such as birth, marriage, and death. Offerings, feasts, and gatherings reinforced bonds between people, ancestors, and the landscape. Sacred spaces were often associated with natural features or communal sites rather than formal buildings. Myth and oral tradition remained important vehicles for transmitting values and identity. Stories about gods, heroes, and ancestral figures were shared during gatherings and within households. These narratives reinforced ideals such as reciprocity, endurance, and responsibility. They did not exist apart from daily life, but provided frameworks for understanding misfortune, success, and obligation. Domestic life was organized around routine and cooperation. Daily tasks included food preparation, textile production, tool maintenance, and animal care. Work was divided according to age, skill, and circumstance, rather than rigid roles. Women played central roles in household management, production, and social organization. Men's activities varied between farming, craftwork, travel, and participation in assemblies. Children learned through observation and participation, gradually taking on responsibility. Food production remained a central concern. Farming practices reflected accumulated knowledge and adaptation to local conditions. Mixed agriculture reduced risk and supported stability. Preservation techniques ensured food supply through winter months. Meals were communal and reinforced household cohesion. Clothing and personal adornment reflected both practicality and status. Garments were produced locally, often from wool or linen. Decoration and accessories signaled identity and connection. Imported items were valued for their rarity and association with distant places. But they were incorporated into existing styles rather than replacing them. Marriage and family formation were shaped by economic and social considerations. Marriages created alliances between households and reinforced networks of support. Negotiation and agreement were central to these arrangements. Inheritance practices varied, balancing continuity of holdings with provision for multiple heirs. These practices influenced settlement patterns and mobility. As Viking societies matured, regional variation increased. Communities shaped by long-term settlement abroad developed distinctive practices while maintaining shared foundations. Legal customs, dialects, and material culture reflected local adaptation. This diversity was not experienced as fragmentation, but as variation within a shared world. Contact with Christian institutions increased during this period, particularly in regions of sustained interaction with Western Europe. Exposure was gradual and uneven. Some individuals adopted new practices, while others maintained traditional beliefs. These changes unfolded quietly, integrated into daily life rather than imposed suddenly. Economic life became more structured. Trade and craft production supported household and community needs. Wealth distribution influenced social relationships and political influence. Redistribution through feasting and gift-giving remained important, reinforcing bonds and obligations. Despite increased complexity, Viking society remained grounded in face-to-face relationships and local responsibility. Authority was negotiated rather than imposed. Law relied on participation. Belief was practiced through routine rather than doctrine. These characteristics allowed Viking societies to maintain cohesion amid change. By the early 11th century, Viking communities had reached a stage of relative stability. The practices that defined daily life were well established, refined through generations of experience. Social structure, law, belief, and domestic routine formed a coherent whole that supported continuity even as external conditions shifted. This maturation did not signal an end to movement or change. Instead, it created a stable foundation upon which further transformation could occur. As political structures evolved and integration deepened, Viking life would continue to adapt, carrying forward familiar patterns into new contexts. The later phase of the Viking Age was defined less by expansion and more by adjustment. During the 10th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavian societies experienced a gradual process of integration into wider political, economic, and cultural frameworks. This transformation did not occur through sudden collapse or forced abandonment of earlier practices. Instead, it unfolded slowly through repeated choices made in daily life as Viking communities adapted to conditions shaped by long-term contact, settlement, and exchange. By this period, movement across seas and rivers was no longer novel. Routes were familiar, destinations known, and patterns of travel established. Many Viking communities had become semi-settled or fully settled in regions beyond Scandinavia. Even within the Scandinavian homelands, daily life was increasingly influenced by wealth, goods, and ideas that had circulated through decades of interaction with other societies. Economic change was one of the most visible forces shaping this transformation. Trade networks that had once depended on individual initiative became more regular and predictable. Markets expanded and exchange became increasingly structured. Silver continued to circulate widely, but its role evolved. It was no longer only a symbol of prestige or a medium of gift exchange. It became a practical tool for managing obligations, resolving disputes, and organizing labor. Households adapted to these changes gradually. Farming remained central, but production increasingly responded to demand beyond the local community. Some households specialized in particular goods, such as livestock, wool, or craft products. This specialization did not replace self-sufficiency, but it complemented it, creating more complex economic relationships between households and regions. Urban centers grew in importance during this period. Towns that had emerged earlier through trade and settlement became more stable and more populous. These towns served as hubs of exchange, administration, and craft production. Viking merchants, artisans, and laborers became integrated into urban life, participating in routines shaped by markets, schedules, and communal regulation. Daily life in towns differed from rural routines, but remained grounded in work and obligation. Artisans organized their time around production cycles. Merchants managed inventories, accounts, and partnerships. Food supply depended on surrounding countryside, reinforcing interdependence between urban and rural communities. These relationships were maintained through regular exchange rather than sporadic contact. Political authority also evolved during this phase. Leadership became more formalized in some regions, though personal relationships remained important. Kingship emerged more clearly in parts of Scandinavia, influenced by models observed abroad. Authority was increasingly associated with territory, law, and institutional continuity, rather than solely with individual reputation. Law continued to play a central role in maintaining order. Assemblies remained important, but legal practice adapted to larger and more complex communities. Written records began to supplement oral tradition in some regions, particularly in matters of landholding and agreement. This shift did not replace customary law but supported it, providing continuity across generations. Belief and religious practice experienced gradual change as well. Contact with Christianity increased through sustained interaction with Christian communities. Conversion, where it occurred, was typically gradual and negotiated. New practices were often integrated into existing routines rather than imposed. Daily life reflected this blending, with familiar seasonal rhythms continuing alongside emerging forms of worship. Family life adapted quietly to these changes. Marriage patterns reflected broader networks of alliance. Inheritance arrangements responded to new forms of wealth and property. Children grew up in environments shaped by both tradition and adaptation, learning through participation rather than instruction. Conflict did not disappear during this period, but it became more regulated. Disputes were increasingly resolved through legal mechanisms rather than violence alone. Stability became more valuable as communities invested in land, infrastructure, and long-term relationships. The costs of disruption grew higher, encouraging restraint. This phase of transformation was uneven. Some regions experienced rapid integration, while others maintained older patterns longer. Variation did not undermine cohesion. Instead, it reflected the flexibility that had always characterized Viking life. Adaptation occurred through use rather than decree. By the early 11th century, Viking societies were no longer defined primarily by movement or expansion. They were shaped by continuity, routine, and integration into wider systems. The Viking Age did not end abruptly. It faded gradually as daily life settled into patterns that felt familiar, even as they differed from earlier generations. This transformation prepared the ground for the final phase of the Viking world, in which continuity mattered more than conquest, and stability replaced expansion as the dominant concern. The integration of Viking communities into broader regional systems continued through countless ordinary decisions made within households, assemblies, and marketplaces. Change was experienced not as a program or policy, but as adjustment to circumstances that had become familiar over time. As generations passed, practices that once marked distinction became routine, and routines that once felt new became customary. This process was cumulative, shaped by repetition rather than by rupture. Economic life continued to reorganize around stability. The circulation of goods became more predictable, supported by regular routes and established relationships. Merchants relied on known partners and customary terms. Craft production followed rhythms set by demand and season. Agricultural output increasingly reflected not only household need, but obligations tied to rent, tax, or exchange. These obligations were negotiated locally, grounded in precedent and trust. The growth of permanent settlements reinforced these patterns. Buildings were maintained and repaired, rather than rebuilt frequently. Storage facilities expanded, reflecting the need to manage surplus and reserve. Paths, harbors, and market spaces were used repeatedly, becoming part of the landscape through habit. The material environment itself began to express continuity. political authority adjusted to these conditions. Where kingship developed, it did so through existing mechanisms of leadership and law. Kings relied on assemblies, advisors, and local leaders. Their authority was reinforced by the ability to guarantee peace, uphold law, and protect trade routes. This authority was practical rather than abstract, judged by outcomes rather than claims. Local leaders continued to play essential roles. They mediated between households and broader authority, translating expectations into practice. Their legitimacy depended on familiarity and responsiveness. Governance remained close to daily life, shaped by shared experience rather than distant command. Law evolved in parallel. Legal memory expanded as communities grew larger and more interconnected. Written records appeared in some contexts, especially where landholding and long-term agreements required clarity. These records supported continuity but did not replace oral process. Law remained participatory, enacted through assemblies and communal recognition. Belief systems continued to adapt quietly. In many regions, Christian practice became more visible, particularly through burial customs, calendar observance, and community gatherings. Adoption was uneven and often selective. Elements that fit existing rhythms were integrated first. Familiar seasonal patterns persisted, providing continuity amid change. Religious buildings, where established, became part of the everyday landscape. They were used regularly and maintained collectively. Religious life emphasized routine rather than spectacle. It marked time, reinforced obligation, and offered explanation without demanding dramatic transformation. Domestic life remained the foundation of society. Households organized work according to season and need. Food preparation, textile production, and maintenance tasks filled daily hours. These routines changed little in form, even as context shifted. Tools improved incrementally, materials varied by region, the structure of work remained stable. Women's roles continued to be central. Household management, production, and social coordination depended on their labor and knowledge. Men's activities varied more widely, but domestic responsibility remained shared. Children learned through participation, absorbing norms through practice. Marriage and kinship continued to structure social networks. Alliances linked households across regions. These ties supported trade, migration, and conflict resolution. Family memory preserved identity across generations, anchoring individuals within a shared past even as circumstances changed. Conflict became less frequent but did not disappear. When it occurred, it was shaped by higher stakes. Disruption threatened established routines and investments. As a result, communities often sought resolution through law and negotiation. Compensation and agreement preserved continuity. The experience of time itself reflected integration. Daily life followed familiar cycles. Seasonal work, religious observance, and communal gatherings structured the year. Change was measured in small adjustments rather than dramatic events. Memory emphasized lineage and precedent. By the later 11th century, the Viking world had been transformed through this slow process of integration. The practices that had once defined Viking life remained present but were no longer distinct. They had merged into broader regional patterns, contributing to societies that continued without the need for outward expansion. The Viking Age, understood as a distinct phase, drew to a close not through conquest or collapse, but through absorption. Life continued, work continued, communities endured. What had changed was the context in which these routines unfolded. This gradual transformation leads naturally into the final phase of the narrative, where continuity becomes more visible than change, and the rhythms of daily life settle into forms that extend beyond the Viking Age itself. The closing phase of the Viking Age unfolded without a clear boundary or decisive moment. It was not marked by a single event that ended movement, belief, or social practice. Instead, it developed through gradual shifts that altered how familiar routines were organized and understood. The people who lived through this period did not experience it as an ending. For them, daily life continued through work, obligation, and community, shaped by structures that had evolved quietly over generations. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavian societies and the communities shaped by Viking movement had become deeply embedded in regional political and economic systems. Overseas travel still occurred, but it no longer defined social identity in the same way. Movement had become ordinary rather than exceptional. The emphasis of life rested increasingly on stability, landholding, and continuity within established communities. Political authority during this phase became more settled. Kingship, where it existed, relied on institutional support rather than personal following alone. Assemblies continued to play important roles, but authority was increasingly exercised through law, taxation, and territorial administration. These developments did not erase older practices. They layered new expectations onto familiar frameworks. The consolidation of authority influenced daily routines. Obligations became more regular. Taxes or dues were assessed with greater consistency. Legal disputes were addressed within more predictable structures. This predictability supported long-term planning within households and communities. Investment in land, buildings, and infrastructure increased as stability grew. Rural life remained the foundation of society. Farming continued to shape the rhythm of the year. Fields were worked, animals tended, and harvests stored according to seasonal cycles that had changed little over centuries. Agricultural techniques improved gradually, reflecting accumulated knowledge rather than sudden innovation. These improvements supported larger populations and more reliable food supply. Village organization became more defined. Boundaries between holdings were recognized and maintained. Communal resources such as pastures and forests were managed through customary agreements. Cooperation remained essential, reinforced by shared dependence on land and labor. Disputes arose, but they were usually resolved through negotiation and precedent. Urban life also became more prominent. Towns that had grown through trade and settlement stabilized as centers of craft production, exchange, and administration. Urban routines followed different rhythms than rural ones, shaped by markets, workshops, and civic obligations. Despite these differences, towns and countryside remained closely linked through exchange of goods and labor. Craft production became more specialized. Artisans refined skills passed down through apprenticeship and practice. Production responded to local and regional demand rather than distant opportunity. This specialization supported stability and identity within towns, reinforcing social structure through shared work. Trade continued but shifted in character. Long-distance routes remained active, though less dominated by individual initiative. Exchange was increasingly regulated through established markets and agreements. Merchants relied on predictable partners and customary practice. Risk remained, but it was managed through experience and reputation. Household life remained central. Domestic routines structured daily experience. Food preparation, textile work, tool maintenance, and care of dependents filled most hours. These activities changed slowly, shaped by material availability and social expectation. Continuity was reinforced through repetition. Family structures reflected both tradition and adaptation. Marriage continued to serve economic and social functions. Kinship networks supported cooperation and conflict resolution. Inheritance practices adjusted to legal and economic conditions, preserving continuity while allowing flexibility. Religious life during this phase was increasingly shaped by Christian practice in many regions. Churches became established features of the landscape. Religious observance structured time through festivals and rites. These practices were integrated into daily life rather than standing apart from it. Older beliefs and customs faded gradually, often leaving traces within routine and tradition. Education and literacy expanded modestly. Written records supported administration, law, and commerce. Literacy remained limited, but its influence grew through documents that shaped obligation and memory. Written culture complemented oral tradition, reinforcing continuity rather than replacing it. Social hierarchy became more defined. Distinctions between elites, common free people, and dependents were reinforced through law and custom. Mobility remained possible but less common. Stability favored continuity over change. Conflict did not disappear, but its character shifted. Warfare became more organized and less frequent at the local level. Violence was increasingly regulated by authority and law. Peace supported economic activity and population growth, reinforcing the value of stability. By the early 12th century, the societies shaped by the Viking Age had settled into patterns that no longer depended on expansion or movement. The practices that had once defined Viking life remained present, but they no longer marked a distinct phase. They had become part of broader regional traditions. Daily life during this time emphasized endurance rather than adventure. Work continued according to season and obligation. Communities relied on memory, custom, and cooperation. Change occurred slowly, embedded in routine rather than event. The Viking Age, understood as a period of outward movement and distinct identity, had dissolved into continuity. What remained were the structures, relationships, and practices shaped during centuries of adaptation. Life continued quietly, shaped by accumulated experience rather than dramatic transformation. As the final phase of the Viking Age progressed, the defining feature of life was not innovation but persistence. The structures that governed work, belief, authority, and social interaction remained in place, shaped by generations of adaptation. What changed was the context in which these structures operated. Expansion ceased to be a central concern, and attention turned increasingly inward toward maintaining order, continuity, and predictability within established communities. Political organization continued to mature quietly. Authority became less dependent on personal presence and more reliant on durable institutions. Law codes, assemblies, and administrative practices gained consistency. Rulers and local leaders emphasized their role as guarantors of peace and stability rather than champions of expansion. This shift affected daily life in subtle ways, reducing uncertainty and allowing households to plan further into the future. Legal practice became more routine. Disputes over land, inheritance, and obligation were common, but increasingly resolved through established procedures. Memory and precedent guided judgment. Written records, where used, preserved agreements across generations. Law functioned less as a response to crisis and more as a framework for ordinary interaction. Economic life reflected similar stabilization. Agriculture remained central, but production was better integrated into local and regional systems. Markets operated regularly. Surplus was managed through storage and exchange rather than immediate consumption. These practices reduced vulnerability and reinforced cooperation between communities. Labor patterns adjusted accordingly. Seasonal rhythms still structured work, but obligations became clearer and more predictable. Rents, dues, and services were expected rather than negotiated anew each year. This regularity supported social order and reduced conflict, even as it limited flexibility. Urban communities continued to develop as centers of routine rather than novelty. Town governance emphasized regulation, maintenance, and continuity. Crafts were organized around established practices and standards. Apprenticeship ensured transmission of skills. Innovation occurred slowly, embedded in refinement rather than disruption. Religious life further integrated into everyday routine. Worship, festivals, and rites of passage structured time and reinforced community identity. Churches functioned as familiar gathering places rather than symbols of transformation. Belief emphasized order, obligation, and continuity, reflecting broader social priorities. Education and literacy remained limited but influential. Clerical and administrative literacy shaped governance and record-keeping. Written culture supported continuity by preserving memory and obligation. Oral tradition persisted alongside it, maintaining shared understanding through story and custom. Family life remained the core of social stability. Households organized labor, care, and transmission of knowledge. Generational continuity anchored identity. Elders preserved memory. Children learned through participation. These processes ensured cultural persistence without deliberate preservation. Social hierarchy stabilized as mobility slowed. Status was inherited more often than earned. Roles were understood and accepted through custom. While inequality persisted, it was normalized through routine rather than contested through disruption. Violence became less central to identity. Warfare still occurred but was increasingly managed by authority rather than individual initiative. Peace was valued for its support of agriculture, trade, and population stability. Communities invested in maintaining order rather than seeking opportunity through conflict. The experience of time during this period emphasized repetition. Days, seasons, and years followed familiar patterns. Memory reached back to ancestors and forward to descendants. Change was measured in small adjustments rather than dramatic events. By this stage, the Viking Age no longer existed as a lived reality. It survived only as memory, story, and inherited practice. The people living within these communities did not identify themselves as part of a distinct age. They lived within traditions shaped by the past but oriented toward continuity rather than expansion. The conclusion of the Viking Age was therefore not an ending but a settling. The movement that once defined life became background. The structures built through travel, trade, and adaptation remained, supporting societies that continued without needing to name their origins. Daily life moved forward quietly. Fields were worked, tools were repaired, markets opened, assemblies met, rituals were observed. Memory and habit carried communities through time without disruption. What remained was not the Viking Age itself, but the world it had shaped. That world continued, steady and familiar, grounded in routine and obligation, fading gently into the rhythms of another age without pause or declaration. The final settling of the world shaped by the Viking Age was defined above all by endurance. What persisted were not the outward expressions of movement and expansion, but the underlying habits that had always sustained life. Communities continued to function through work, cooperation, and shared expectation. The rhythms established over centuries remained intact, carrying society forward without interruption. In rural areas, daily life remained closely tied to land and season. Fields were prepared, sown, and harvested according to patterns refined through long experience. Livestock were tended with careful attention to breeding, health, and winter survival. These routines required cooperation among households and reinforced long-standing relationships within villages. The land itself became a record of continuity, shaped by repeated use rather than dramatic change. Tools and techniques evolved slowly. Improvements were adopted when they proved reliable, not because they were new. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through demonstration and repetition. Innovation was measured by usefulness rather than novelty. This approach favored stability and reduced risk, ensuring survival in environments that still demanded caution. Households continued to serve as centers of production and care. Daily tasks filled the hours with predictable labor. Food preparation, textile work, maintenance, and childcare structured time. These activities rarely entered formal records, yet they formed the substance of life. Through them, values were transmitted and memory preserved. Community relationships remained essential. Cooperation governed access to shared resources such as pastures, forests, and water. Agreements were reinforced through custom and precedent. Disputes arose, but they were addressed within familiar frameworks. Resolution mattered more than victory, reflecting the shared interest in continuity. Urban centers followed parallel patterns of settling. Towns focused on maintenance rather than growth. Buildings were repaired, streets cleared, and markets regulated. Civic routines emphasized order and predictability. Artisans practiced established crafts. Merchants relied on known partners and routes. The pace of life favored reliability over expansion. Political authority during this phase was judged by its ability to preserve peace. Rulers and local leaders were expected to maintain order, protect resources, and uphold law. Their success was measured in stability rather than conquest. Authority became quieter, expressed through administration rather than display. Law continued to function as a framework for ordinary interaction. Assemblies met regularly. Agreements were reaffirmed. Written records, where present, preserved memory across generations. Legal practice emphasized continuity, ensuring that obligations and rights remained recognizable over time. Religious observance blended seamlessly into daily routine. Festivals marked the year. Rites of passage, structured life events, sacred spaces became familiar gathering places. Belief offered explanation and reassurance without demanding dramatic change. Religious life reinforced social order and continuity. Memory played a central role in this settled world. Oral tradition preserved stories of ancestors and origins. These stories were not calls to action, but affirmations of belonging. They connected present life to the past without urging return to it. Memory functioned as grounding rather than motivation. Children grew into this world through participation. They learned work, custom, and expectation by doing. Education was informal and continuous. Elders served as sources of knowledge and authority. Generational continuity anchored identity within familiar frameworks. The experience of time emphasized repetition. Days followed established routines. Seasons returned predictably. Years passed, marked by work and observance rather than event. Change occurred slowly, absorbed into habit without disruption. By this stage, the distinctiveness of the Viking Age had dissolved completely. What remained were communities shaped by its legacy, but no longer defined by it. The practices that once supported movement now supported stability. The skills developed through expansion were applied to maintenance and care. Life did not announce a new beginning, it continued. The world moved forward through ordinary acts repeated without reflection. Fields were worked, boats were repaired, markets opened and closed, assemblies gathered and dispersed, rituals were observed. The Viking Age ended not with silence or conclusion, but with continuation. Its presence lingered in habit and memory, woven into the fabric of daily life. The transition passed unnoticed by those living it, carried forward by routine and obligation. What remained was a steady world, shaped by accumulated experience, settling gently into the rhythms of another age, without boundary, without declaration, and without end.